Okay, I think let me welcome everyone here today to a Cold War Studies seminar. I am very pleased to have an eminent historian of the Soviet Union here, whom I just saw actually at NYU a couple of weeks ago. But she is living mostly in Australia these days, but taught at several U.S. universities, particularly the University of Chicago, for many years. I know quite a few of the students who had her as their PhD supervisor and speak with great reverence about her. She has written many books about the Russian Revolution, about the 1930s under Stalin, about a wonderful book about 25 years ago called Everyday Stalinism. That's, I think, my favorite of her books. But there are numerous others that I have benefited from a great deal, including one on Stalin's team, which looks at the factionalization of the Soviet leadership in the final years under Stalin and then in the early post-Stalin period. And then more recently, she's also written a memoir, which I would recommend to anyone. And this book, Lost Souls, Soviet Displaced Persons and the Birth of the Cold War, which looks at, it has drawn on a wide variety of sources to piece together the stories of people who were displaced. There were vast numbers of people displaced from the Soviet Union, and this book partly gives a voice to them, but also looks at how it affected the emerging Cold War. So with that, let me please give it to Sheila.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Right. So,
here you go.
no,
Princeton University Press and its supplies.
I'll hold it up. Since Princeton is so bad at distribution, I feel I have to do my own little efforts. But there are 2 copies I saw in the Harvard bookstore. I also, since I might as well sort of advertise myself while I'm here. I will say that in a few months, I have another little book coming out called Death of Stalin, which I think, I hope is quite fun. It's
one of the most monumental events of the 20th century.
Well, it's in a series called Monumental Events in their aftermath. But I decided to play off the Yanucci film because, that's that wonderful black comedy. And as far as it goes about the death, it's fine. But what they didn't get is what happened afterwards. In other words, these bumblers who are running around at the dacha don't know what to do. When they get in the Kremlin, they really do know what to do. And they set up a new administration and they bring in reforms very, very speedily. So that was a fun book to write. Or you might even call it a quasi book. I mean, it's the new 30,000 word limit. Books are getting smaller and smaller. And this, anyway.
Is that with Cambridge University Press? Which publisher?
No, it's Old Street Publishing.
Okay.
Yeah, in the UK. Mm-hmm. No, books, Princeton and Cambridge and so on, their books are not particularly getting smaller as far
Cambridge
as I know.
does have a new series of shorter books.
Oh, yeah, that's right, it does, yeah. So everybody is wanting things in sort of bite-sized form. Anyway, I assume I should
talk for about 45 minutes.
Talk for about 45 minutes about lost souls, about the Soviet displaced person.
I'll hand this around. It is my copy, however, so I want it back.
Right. Now, in this book, there are 2 major themes, and one of them is the one I'm going to talk about today, and that is the political and diplomatic. In other words, the displaced persons as a refugee crisis that needed a solution and incredibly got one. Now, the other thing I do in this book, since I'm a social historian and I always tend to gravitate that way, the other theme is about DP agency. And that's not going to be my topic today, but I'm very happy to talk about it, in Q&A if people want to ask about it. The very first and significant part of DP agency is when these displaced persons refuse to go home, and that basically makes the Allies react, and and sets off train of consequences. But I argue that DP agency, collective and individual, is a much more interesting phenomenon than you would ever know from the DP memoirs, which always say I was a pawn of fate. And in other words, I had no agency. So back to the diplomacy and in fact the Cold War. As I said, this is a refugee crisis that gets solved. And of course, once I went into the book, I was simply investigating the displaced persons and their resettlement and also their repatriation to some extent. I didn't come in with a sort of fixed idea about this whole operation. But when I'd finished the book, I thought this is an incredible success. Within 7 years, you have about 1 million people resettled in first world countries without a huge amount of fuss and having been comfortably accommodated for most of the previous time. And so I thought that really deserves investigation, or rather thought, about what would have made this possible. Now, in the sort of crudest terms, what made it possible was that the US Congress paid for it. But why the US Congress paid for it is, of course, the next question. And my argument is that this was a Cold War product, one of the good products, you might say, of the Cold War. In other words, because these DPs could be represented as victims of communism rather than, as they were originally defined, victims of war, the Second World War, and Nazism, that made them, well, it's a big propaganda win, right? That they chose democracy, they chose the free world over communism. Now, the remarkableness of the success of the solution of this DP problem can be gauged, I think, from the fact that as of 1947, 48, the United Nations, then a new organization, the United Nations concentrated, it felt it had two big refugee problems on its plate. Now, that there were other refugee problems in the world, notably in Asia, but that was not within their remit. So two big problems. One of them is the displaced persons from Eastern Europe, and the other, the Palestinians. About an equal number of people, 700,000 to 1 million in both cases. Well, so one problem was solved within 7 years, and the other one, well, we know it hasn't been solved. So let's backtrack and think about who it is that's the subject of this talk. Displaced persons were the people, non-Germans, and who found themselves in Germany, Austria, and Italy at the end of the Second World War, having been removed from wherever they came from, or removed themselves in the course of the war. The biggest category was forced laborers from Eastern Europe. From all countries of Eastern Europe. I'm focusing particularly on those who came from the Soviet Union and the parts of the Soviet Union, primarily Ukraine and Russia, occupied by the Germans during the war. So forced laborers is one big category. Former prisoners of war is another category. They took a while to get processed and out of other camps into the DP camps. But that happens. And they're a complex group because some of them are just straightforward Soviet people who were captured by the Germans in Soviet armed forces and kept in prisoners of war camp. But another large group are people who actually fought under German command in the Second World War. The Vlasov people, that's one group. They recruited in the POW camps. Others were recruited outside of the camps. Now I'll say more later about collaboration and what that meant. It can cover a whole series of different contingencies. For example, to say that anyone who joined the Vlasov army was a convinced Nazi, that would be completely wildly wrong. But even to say that such a person was necessarily strongly ideological is wrong too. I think because in the German POW camps, the conditions were bad, chances of dying were quite high, and if the Vlasov people come through with German permission to recruit, that's one way of trying to save your life. I mean, it's a gamble too, but I think many people probably joined for that reason. Now, there are other people in the displaced persons group. I'm focusing here on the Soviet contingent. And those were people who, at the time of the German retreat, having occupied large parts of the Soviet Union during the war, as they retreated, some Soviet citizens went with them, seeing the chance, either because they were linked with the Germans, had worked with them or whatever, or because they saw a chance of getting across the frontier, across the border, which normally wouldn't be available. There's a particularly large wave of departures from the Baltic states, and in the fall of 1944, as the Germans are retreating and the Soviet army is about to come in again. Now, I should say at this point, when I talk about Soviet DPs, what exactly do I mean? The Soviet Union. I'm basically following the Soviet definition, though I don't think I follow their precepts and other requests, and that is anybody who held Soviet citizenship at the outbreak of war in 1941. Now that means that there are people from, as it were, the old Soviet Union. The Soviet Union that had existed since basically the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, formalized in the early 20s as the Soviet Union. But there are also a large number of these DPs are actually from territories incorporated forcibly into the Soviet Union by the terms of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939. Those are the people, the Baltic states were forcibly incorporated, and so were parts of West Ukraine and Western Belarus, which had been previously under Polish rule. And this is important to remember. In the first place, there's a disproportionate number of people from the newly incorporated states, in part because they're simply on the western side. It was easier to get out from there. But the second important thing is that, of course, they don't consider themselves to be Soviet citizens in great part. They are much more likely to see the Soviet Union as an occupying power in their country. And that is extremely relevant for the question of repatriation. Now, the general attitude of the Allies as of 1944-5, is that they were bound by the Yalta Agreement, and indeed by sort of normal common sense in a way, to the repatriation of all citizens who found themselves outside their borders, whoever that might be. But in the Soviet case, problems quickly arise when it becomes clear that a substantial number don't want to repatriate. Now, the majority of that substantial number are probably from the newly incorporated territories, although there is no way of knowing that, because here, to introduce another important thing to know about DPs, they tell a lot of lies about who they are. In other words, depending on what is the most advantageous statement to make about yourself, it was not an advantageous statement to make about yourself to say that you came from the Soviet Union. And so many people, in fact, didn't make it, but made other claims. And as for the question of whether you came from the newly incorporated regions of the Soviet Union or the old Soviet Union, nobody ever even asked that. The Soviets treated it as a non-question, and the Allies also, although they had policies on it, but they never made any attempt to find out seriously who was from the old West Ukraine, who was from the old Soviet Ukraine. So millions of Soviet citizens get repatriated without too much incident up to early 1946, when the Allies stopped cooperating with it. But there is a substantial number left. Now, exactly what that number is impossible to tell because people, DPs, are self-identified in every respect. In other words, you ask, where do you come? What is your citizenship? Or they call it nationality? What's your name? Where were you born? And when were you born? And are you married? Now, the answers to all those questions could be true or not true because they were not required. In fact, the refugee agencies were told not to ask for identity documents, even if people had them. So there's a tremendous amount of creative reinvention, self-reinvention in this. The Soviets, of course, were very keen on estimating how many of their people were displaced because they wanted them back. Their persistent idea was that the Western powers were trying to steal their people, that these people were their property and they should be returned. So for that purpose, they have repatriation people in Europe, and they tried to make estimates. They came up with estimate of about 450,000 Soviet citizens. That includes, I think, 150,000, maybe 200,000 from the Baltics, and then an unknown number from the West Ukraine and West Belarusia, but probably fairly substantial. The Allied estimates, on the other hand, will never believe an Allied estimate of Soviet DPs because these Allied estimates are always presented in response to the Soviet demands for the return of their citizens. So when the Soviets would come and they'd say to the British occupying forces or the Americans, we know you've got lots and lots of DPs in your camps, hand them over. The British and the Americans and even the French, who were relatively well disposed to the Soviets, would generally say, no, we don't. We only have 104 or something people who call themselves Soviet DPs. And the Soviets would then say in great annoyance, but they're hiding under other nationality labels, which was true. The Allies would say, well, can't do anything about that. We don't. So the Allied estimates are worthless because it was in their interest not to try to estimate. Whether the Soviet estimate is too high, I don't know. It's in some ways, I mean, insofar as you can check its plausibility. I tried to do it when I worked on the particular contingent of Soviet DPs that subsequently settled in Australia. And the proportions that the Soviets claim are roughly, they correspond more or less with what are right. So it could be right, but on the other hand, there's no way of telling. So the agency initially in charge of these displaced persons is called UNRRA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, set up during the war, the Soviet Union and the other allies as members. However, the money came largely from the US. Theoretically, the money came from all the contributing members. The British, although they paid quite a lot in terms of their current resources, they didn't pay as much as they were due to pay according to the formal scheme. And the Soviets paid essentially nothing. On the US, although if you look, I forget what formally they should have been paying, but really they're paying sort of 80% or so of UNRRA. And they are unhappy with UNRRA. UNRRA is not only dealing with refugees, it's also dealing with the broader questions of post-war reconstruction. They are specifically helping with the reconstruction of the economy in Poland, in Soviet Ukraine, and elsewhere. And that causes a lot of angst as it becomes clear to people in Congress that this is supporting communist governments. In the Soviet case, in the case of Ukraine, just a straightforwardly communist government. In the Polish case, a government more or less communist and under newly communist and under Soviet influence. So UNRRA loses out as Cold War sentiment gets stronger, and in the US Congress, the notion of supporting an agency that is supporting reconstruction in communist countries becomes less appealing, and basically UNRRA pulls the plug. The Congress pulls the plug on UNRRA. Now, UNRRA had always said our mission is repatriation. That's the only possible outcome. But they also were not willing, nor had they the capacity, had they been willing, to force displaced persons who didn't want to return. So this introduced a note of uncertainty about UNRRA, because UNRRA's mission is repatriation, but it can't repatriate. So what's the future on this? And they say, well, it's care and maintenance until such time as a solution is reached. Now, care and maintenance is expensive, all the more since these DPs were living in extremely favorable circumstances compared to just about any refugee group you could name, in proper houses with rooms, not in tents. They were aware that tents was the option for other refugees often. Barracks, schools, hospitals, whatever public buildings could be commandeered. Also, sometimes private houses are taken from the Germans, who, of course, were not the DP's rations being supplied by the occupying forces. They were better than the German rations. So there's quite, and the DPs are also very active in the black market. So they and regarded by the Germans, therefore, as criminals. So there's a lot of tension there. So U.S. Congress pulls the plug on the funding, also basically saying UNRRA is too left-leaning an organization. And indeed, on the American side, it did have a lot of New Deal people in there. And undoubtedly, there were socialists, and the British contingent is mainly military and not at all well disposed to the Soviet Union. The British contingent within UNRRA, which is multinational in its staffing, the American contingent tends to be more New Deal-ish. So having closed down UNRRA, the US solution, or the next thing, is to create a new agency, which, as was emphasized, should be fully under US control, just dealing with refugee question. And that is the International Refugee Organization, the IRO. And the IRO has a new mission, and that mission is resettlement. Now, resettlement where is, of course, a question, because the US is not actually putting up its hand for resettlement in the US in large numbers. They had taken, initially it was meant to be about 25,000, and it ended up larger. Truman had taken a bunch of DPs, mainly Jewish, quite soon after the war. But then the question of taking a larger number was held up because of opposition to it and argument about its provisions until 1948, when the Displaced Persons Bill finally passed, opening the way for resettlement in the US. But IRO is operating from 1947, and it's already resettling people then. Europe was not basically considered to be an option for long-term, large-scale resettlement. Britain had taken quite a few, but outside of the IRO framework, and IRO doesn't really, there's tension about that. And the British, although it did prove to be permanent, resettlement. That wasn't how it was written at first, and the dependents weren't allowed to come, and all kinds of problems about that. The Belgians took some for work in the mines, but their DPs didn't like working in the mines, and also the long-term prospects were uncertain. There was worry at that point about leaving too many. It was felt to be important to get these people out of Germany and Austria because they themselves will need such thoroughgoing. They don't want to have that drain. The Allies don't want that drain on their economies. Now, actually, Germany could have managed it, but nobody knew about the Wirtschaftswunder, which was still a few years in the future. So we're looking outside of Europe, and for the time being, United States is not in there, so the countries that step up, they go around saying who wants some labor, who could use these people, and the people the nations that respond are basically looking for labor. Australia is the second biggest, turns out to be, after the United States, which, considering its absolutely tiny population at the time, 7 million, was huge in terms of Australia's future. Canada comes after that, and then various Latin American countries. There were initial hopes that lots and lots of them would be taken by Latin America, but it turned out not to be so. Then, of course, there is the separate issue involving Jewish DPs, many fewer than the Slavic DPs, and with a very different trajectory. Sometimes in the literature, the DP story tends to be told as if it was just a Jewish DP story, but that is basically a different kind of story, because the Jewish DPs who are in their DP phase strongly Zionist and insisting on their right to be resettled in Palestine, which will become the state of Israel in 1948. They always had a place to go as soon as the British stopped objecting to their large-scale arrival. The British objections were, although strong, the British had the mandate there. They were strong, but they were always time limited. In other words, they were saying, not now while there's fighting going on, but ultimately, yes. So the Jewish DPs are really not. They are not in the position of the other ones of having no place to go. And nobody ever tried to repatriate the Jewish DPs. I mean, a Jewish DP from Poland is not identified as Polish by nationality, but Jewish. And that was the insistence of the DPs themselves. The Allies were uneasy about it at first. So nobody ever says that they should be sent back to Poland or Czechoslovakia or anywhere. It is assumed that they have to be resettled, and it is assumed that ultimately Palestine, Israel will be a major destination. Now, in fact, the Jewish DPs also had the option, once the mass resettlement scheme, which the Slavic DPs went on, was put into operation. They had the option of going, if they were still in Europe, they could go on that. They were eligible for it, but they had the other possibility. And in fact, quite large numbers of them did end up by going on mass resettlement with the other DPs primarily to the US, but also to Australia. Now, the fact that the countries that sign up are interested in labor, in getting labor, that underlay or at least gave a degree of plausibility to the Soviet claim that not only are their citizens being stolen, but they are being stolen for capitalist labor. Or, they would call it slave labor or whatever. Now, actually, in the Australian case, although it was not slave labor for 2 years, it was more or less indentured labor. You were sent off to wherever the state wanted you to go for 2 years. The countries, the receiving countries, were allowed in their negotiations with IRO, they could both list the nationalities that they preferred to receive in their order of preference, and they could list the occupations that they wanted to receive. Now, the nationality list, these were never published, but you can find them in the internal correspondence. They are interesting, partly because of the attempts to rank the various Slavic people in terms of desirability. The Australians had a lot of trouble with the Belarusians because they couldn't find out who they were. The British had a similar problem, but I think they found out quicker. In other words, some people said in the Australian internal correspondence that Belarusians are people from Belarusia in the Soviet Union, and others said, no, Belarusian means white Russians, there's the emigres. So Australia always has this question mark about Belarusians when it lists desirability. It never even lists Russians because it didn't realize it was getting any, although it got thousands of them under other names. And Jews are at the bottom of the Australian list of preference. And that was true of virtually all the South American countries except Paraguay. If anybody understands the Paraguayan anomaly, do explain it to me. Paraguay took very few people, but they preferred Russians and Jews, a unique combination that nobody else would have gone for. It annoyed IRO that they thought these preferences were racist, which is hard to deny. And IRO, in the case of Australia, which I've investigated in some detail in a book called White Russians, Red Peril, IRO cooperated behind the scenes with Joint, the big Jewish refugee organization, to circumvent Australian requirements. In other words, they didn't, some Jews went on mass resettlement to Australia, but a larger group were so-called landing permit people. Landing permits meant that you had to be individually approved and you had to show you had some financial resources. So Joint puts up the financial resources and IRO sends them on their ships in clear contravention of Australian wishes. And if you look at the result of Australia's attempt to limit Jewish migration in this group, you can see it likely had virtually no effect. In other words, the Jewish proportion of DPs that actually got to Australia as against that in the camps is roughly similar. So despite the effort to discriminate, they didn't. Now, then discrimination on basis of occupation, white-collar occupations, of course, they are not desired at all. What everybody wants is blue-collar. And I found a very nice file in an Australian archive, which was about one of the first ships that sailed with DPs from Latvia to Australia. And in accordance with Australia's desires, the great majority of people on board these DPs were identified as general laborers, agricultural laborers, building laborers, for the women, domestic servants, nurses' aides, low status occupations. Now, when that boat arrived in Australia and an immigration officer got on board, they got completely different answers about who was on the boat. There were opera singers, there were professors of theology, including a woman. There were children of diplomats. There were a great number of people who spoke English, which is not what you would get with Australia had expressed its preference as for horny-handed sons of toil. Well, they're not what you would expect. The English language would not be very widely distributed there. Now, there's one other thing I'll mention about the resettlement process, and that is another aspect of racial selection, so to speak, which hasn't got a great deal of attention, and that is the question of the DPs being the Soviet DPs being collectively identified as European, which means white. Now, in the Australian case, that was important because there was a white Australia policy that said we don't let in any migrants who are not white. And that seemed to be fine because it was known that Russians are European and therefore white. But then somebody noticed that, in fact, it is a multi-ethnic society and not everybody is European. There are a whole series of Asian groups, including the Bashkirs and Kalmyks and so on. So the Australians had a bit of trouble with that, but finally they decided to dismiss it, except insofar as they could make visual identification. In other words, they look at somebody and think that person looks Asian, or they put it Mongol, or their children do, and therefore better not let them in. But they never wrote this down as the reason for not letting them in. One has the record, one has memoirs of people who were involved in that service to tell us that. But what they would write down is, politically undesirable or whatever. Now, I should say that you didn't get selected by any country unless you gave as your reason for not returning to the Soviet Union or your home country political reasons, a dislike, a refusal to live under communism. There was a standard thing. There was that everybody knew you had to say, and everybody said it. It, of course, we probably have a group that is extremely anti-communist and anti-Soviet anyway, but because they are required to make that statement, there's an element of, simply of complication in that. But to get back to the racial element, the US didn't have a white America policy explicitly, but with regard to the DPs, they were identified as a European group who would be given special immigration privileges. And so the same question came up when it was noted that not all everybody from the Soviet Union would be described as European. And the big argument comes with the Kalmyks. The Kalmyks, who have a complicated descent, but basically of Mongol origin, as far as one can see, and coming from the Asian part of the Soviet Union, although they had moved in many cases. Anyway, the Kalmyks, they were well organized as DPs, as many DP groups, national DP groups were, but they were particularly well organized. And in the archives, you find, first of all, their individual requests for permission for selection for United States immigration, and then also the collective ones. Their individual ones tend to be based on the argument that their ancestors intermarried with Russians over the generations, and therefore they are essentially European. They have become essentially European. But the collective ones add another theme, which is that they have always been characterized by democracy, that they're Europeans in that sense, that their instincts have always been democratic way back from the mists of time. And this, in addition to the fact that they've intermarried with Russians, makes them essentially European. Now, that argument was put in a court case that the IRO in Washington conducted with the immigration department, in which they argued that the Kalmyks, who had been refused entry on the grounds they were not European, that Kalmyks qualified as European. And these arguments were put, both the democratic one and the intermarried one. And I was, to me, somewhat incredibly, IRO won that case. In other words, they had the arguments they made were accepted, that the Kalmyks were essentially white. Again, you had to have all these asterisks saying, note that white is a complicated thing with regard to Russians, because white emigres, or Russian emigres, and Kalmyk emigres too, are sometimes called white, but we're talking about other kind of white. In any case, they get to be admitted. Now, I just want to throw in a little bit from my my sub-theme, my other theme, which is the theme of DP agency. Now, I mentioned DP agency in terms of refusing repatriation, but it's also important in the new definition that emerges under IRO of what a DP is. The original definition of a DP, which is written in the Constitution of UNRRA and IRO, is a victim of war and Nazism, the Second World War and Nazism. If you had not been displaced by the war and by the Nazis, that didn't count as displacement under these terms. Now, when we're dealing with Soviet and other East European DPs, the places they have come from are now under communist rule or near offer, and they are refusing to return to it. So this is the basis of first of all, a redefinition, an informal redefinition by the DPs themselves of who they are, and subsequently of a definition that the IRO implicitly accepts. The DPs were, they more or less organized, the camps are more or less organized by nationality. That wasn't the IRO's wish, but that's the DP's wish. And so if you were a Latvian, you tended to move from a Latvian who found yourself in a Ukrainian camp, you tend to move to the Latvian and so on. They are given self-government. This comes from UNRRA, but IRO carried it on. So this is US democratic principles, I guess, in operation. They are allowed to elect their own administrations and appoint their own officials, including police, to supervise the camp. And these are paid by UNRRA and later by IRO. And almost all of these are extremely nationalist in spirit and anti-communist and anti-Soviet, so that within the camps, the understanding of who we, the DPs, are, it very quickly emerges as we are victims of communism. We're not victims, forget the war, forget Nazism. We're victims of communism, and that you can see really within a year of the words. It's very clear in the camps. And it percolates up into the administering organizations, though they never actually change the formal definition. Well, I mean, they can't change their constitution, so they don't change the formal definition, but in practice they do. And that rebranding is a prerequisite for the successful resettlement program. Now, the other issue that comes up is about collaborators. Initially, collaborators people who have collaborated with the Germans are not formal, and they're not eligible for DP status and the privileges it brings. However, a counter narrative develops, fostered by various nationalist organizations and also the Tolstoy Foundation and the European Office. And the counter narrative is that these people who look like collaborators are, in fact, the strongest anti-communists of them all. They cared so much about fighting communism that they were prepared to do it with whomever. And the Germans were the people that offered the chance to fight against the Soviets. So that gradually that argument is more and more accepted by IRO, although it still has the problem that its constitution says you can't give DP status to anyone who was a collaborator. But internally, they start to say there's an eligibility commission. They start to say, let's be more liberal. That's their term, more liberal in deciding who was a collaborator. Let's give people the benefit of the doubt. And as a result, you have a very curious statistic. Many of IRO's statistics are curious, but this is a particularly interesting one. They have in their final report a year-by-year number of people resettled, starting 47, 48, 49. up to 51 or 2. And for the first 3 or 4 years, they're resettling hundreds of thousands a year, and yet the numbers of DPs also increases. It goes up every year despite the outflow. So these, I assume, are people coming into DP status who previously hadn't been able to obtain it. Now, there's a whole after story involving that collaborator's story and including the war crimes of which accusations developed against some of them, but that is going to lie dormant until the 1980s and 90s as far as the immediate resettlement process is concerned. It's a non-problem. We're not going to talk. The threat is communism. The threat is not Nazism because the war is over. That's all gone. This is obviously a Cold War attitude. Now, if I would, in conclusion, I've argued that it was the Cold War that made possible the solution of this particular refugee problem, and of course that does raise the question of whether one can provide a recipe for a solution of future problems. But I'm afraid that probably that isn't the case, because if you extrapolating from this case, one might say that a recipe for success in solving a major refugee problem is, first of all, you have a superpower with abundant funds, an ideological platform, and an enemy. Your refugees are white, or else they can pass themselves off as such. They are branded democratic by themselves, and that is accepted. And the victimizing agent is identifiable with the superpower's enemy. Its authoritarian enemy, or sometimes totalitarian enemy. Now, these are not circumstances that most refugee groups are unfortunately able to reproduce, and therefore we may not have that many big successes of that kind with other refugee problems. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Let me just start. I'm going to open it for questions from the audience, but let me just ask a couple of questions to start. One would be, first of all, the DP problem here was only part of the human dislocation caused by the war. For example, in East Asia, Japan's occupation of vast swaths of East Asia, Northeast Asia, and Southeast Asia had also led to enormous displacement of people, and these were not white people. So if you could comment, I know that this has not been the focus of what you're looking at, but it did come up. The issue did come up in thinking about how to handle European DP. So if you could comment on that. There was also, though, the forced migration that was overseen by Stalin, both during the war and then immediately after. Part of this was because the borders of various countries, particularly Poland, were changed through the settlements that Stalin had insisted on. And so as a result, there were about 12.5 million ethnic Germans expelled from Poland and Czechoslovakia mainly, and limited numbers from other countries. And then there were also hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Poles who were forcibly exchanged in reciprocal expulsions, culminating with Akcja Wisła in the case of Poland expelling Ukrainians, and then to the newly enlarged Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But then there were also the mass deportations during the war in 1943 and 44, including, Kalmyks were among the national groups deported. So how did so many Kalmyks end up in DPs? I know there were some who escaped the mass deportations, but was that where they came from? That is, where else would they have come from? And then one final thing would be, with regard to the Jews here, because about half of Europe's Jewish population was annihilated during the war, did that have an impact at any point on how Jews were viewed? Because as you mentioned, they were given the lowest rung on the ladder, and at least in for certain countries, resettlement preferences. And so did they take account of that enormous numbers of Jews had been killed, or was that just a separate issue that didn't affect DP policy? Please.
Well, big ones. Okay, first of all, Asia. Yeah, the IRO, it's called International Refugee Organization, but it basically washed its hands of Asia. I mean, they were aware of mass displacement under Japanese rule, and they just sort of said, "What can we do about that?" So there are only two groups that they pay attention to, IRO, in Asia. One is the European Jews in Shanghai. And the other one is the Russians, is white Russians, the Harbinsi, who, well.
Expert on that subject right there.
Right. Well, it's the, I mean, they Harbinsi is, of course, an odd term for the ones that found themselves in Shanghai. But Russians from either the Shanghai and other coastal cities or Manchuria who were in Shanghai as of the communist takeover, the IRO organizes there. First, it tries to find a place to take them. That's a group, by the way, selected by Russian nationalist organization, Judenfrei, essentially. But anyway, so they can't find a place for them. And they finally send them to Tubabao in the Philippines, which is willing to take them for a little while, and organizes their resettlement from there. And many went to Australia, some went to San Francisco, and so on. So the IRO got over that problem by basically saying, we can't handle that. I can't handle Asia. Yeah, I mean, the forced, obviously, the resettlement of the displaced persons is part of that great canvas of forced and semi-forced and organized and whatever movement of peoples. It isn't usually put in there because it's not done by a state. I mean, it's done by an international organization, but clearly it belongs there. And at various times, other groups impinge. For example, the Germans expelled from Eastern Europe. There's about 10 million of them in Germany and Austria after the war and in the immediate years. UNRRA and IRO do not accept them. They are not eligible for DP status. The Germans have to look after them. That's the that's the argument. And there is, because of the difference of privilege, there are Volksdeutsch in less good camps in Germany. And some of them some people manage to cross over from the less good status to the better status, informally, of course. After the war, when the Allies depart, leaving the hardcore of people who can't be resettled. And I forgot to say that that is, of course, the physically and mentally ill, the disabled, the aged, and the intellectuals. Intellectuals were a drug on the market. Nobody wanted them. But
intellectuals.
Intellectuals.
Along with mentally disabled.
Yes, I mean, this is not
the same point.
Yeah.
This is an absurd. This is not. Nobody writes down saying we will leave for the hardcore. These ones. This is a matter that when the hardcore is left, the IRO is saying, "What we're still desperately trying to get rid of the last 150,000," and they have a list of who they are. And I forgot to say that there are also some security threats there. Some people whose security, whose political reliability is questioned, so nobody will take them. But yeah, so it's a very it's a sort of strange group. But yes, another thing I would say about how the Kalmyks, there is a story, and I ought to remember it, about how the Kalmyks managed to get out. I assume that the bulk of them were fleeing that deportation, but no, probably they did it before. That's right. They went with the Germans in, but they already had organized sort of military units, and so they arrived in the West in that form. Now, the odd thing about Soviet repatriation is that they would take absolutely anybody. It had to be a citizen. They wouldn't, non-citizens, they wouldn't take even if they were married to citizens, but anyone who'd been a Soviet citizen, they would take. So they would happily take a Kalmyk. Okay, the Kalmyks had been deported, but they'd take a Kalmyk. They'd take Germans, Soviet Germans could repatriate. There was absolutely no national ban on repatriation. Now, of course, the question of what do you do with, if you've ever repatriated Kalmyk, does that Kalmyk get sent to Kalmykia or to wherever the Kalmyks have been? That is a more complicated story, but it is remarkable. It's one of the things that has most struck me about the Soviet attitude, because there is a question, why are they so insistent on getting back their people? And you can say labor needs, population loss. But then when you look at the fact that they are scouring the psychiatric hospitals of Germany to get Soviet DPs back, and they actually, the people doing that appear to have they don't see themselves as forcing people back. They see themselves as rescuing poor people who are stranded. That's the self-image of the Soviet repatriation officers. There were lots of DPs in psychiatric hospitals. Other nationalities did not want psychiatrically disturbed DPs repatriating, but the Soviet Union not only accepted, but did its best to produce, to facilitate. Now, on the view of Jews in the Holocaust, this is too early for understanding of the Holocaust to have made its way. I mean, of course, the Jewish communities in the receiving countries, they fully understand the Holocaust, and they try to make their case, and they are part of the political process in both the US and Australia, arguing that for the largest possible reception. But in the Australian case, the Prime Minister, who personally not anti-Semitic, personally sympathetic to the cause of Jews coming, but feels that he is afraid of backlash, because there had been backlash about Russian-speaking Jews from China coming in just after the war, so feels obliged to impose what is in effect a quota. So it's probably, I don't know, is it 10 years or so before that kind of attitude is changed?
One other thing, Sheila, could you say a bit on, because Stalin had a very jaundiced view of Soviet POWs. Could you say how he specifically looked on the DPs? Did he see them in the same very negative light that he did with POW, Soviet soldiers who had been captured?
I tried to find any indication of any attention paid by Stalin to this issue. I looked in at the topics discussed, in Politburo meetings and in his office. Never, no one. A Soviet Repatriation Agency man, I think, is there once. In other words, it is clearly not a big item on Stalin's personal agenda. Now there is in Europe, the DPs and the Allies both assume that it's going to be 100% to Gulag. Anyone who goes back, you'll be sent to Gulag immediately because you're suspect from contact to the West. Archives are open, in the last 15 years or so, show this was not the case, that only 7% went to Gulag, which is very different. However, about, I think it's just over half get sent home. Of those, almost, there are women among the DPs as well as men. women are almost automatically judged not to be a security risk. They don't get sent to Gulag except in the most unusual circumstances. They are just sent home. So the majority of that group that is sent home would be women, but some men also get sent home. However, the most usual thing for someone sent back, a man, repatriated, was to be sent, to be drafted immediately into a labor unit or back into the army. In other words, so that's a finite bit. That's not Gulag, but you're still not having any choice. Now, there's quite an interesting story, but I haven't got time to go into it in detail about reception. I mean, it's a story that Seth Bernstein has told to some extent. This, I think, we need to do, though. This is a very good book. The Repatriation Agency is a sort of soft Soviet agency. They're always trying to look out for the DPs as against the MVD and the other and the military. And so they actually come, their offices come from GRU, but never mind, they function as a soft agency. And they try to protect their DPs and get them jobs when they come back and not have them subject to reprisal and so on. And they actually keep little lists of their successes, but they're rather short lists. And in the on-the-ground truth of is that you came back as a DPU, you might well, and were sent home, you might well have trouble with the authorities subsequently, but you almost certainly would have trouble with your neighbors if you didn't take steps to conceal that part of your biography, which I think most people did.
Okay, let me open it for questions, please. Here.
Yeah.
Right here.
Yeah, I want to ask about those prisoners of war and collaborators, or collaborators also. Weren't there really no screening mechanisms imposed by International Refugee Organization towards these groups?
There was screening, yes, but there were protests against screening as well. And a screening done by the US military and the British military, not by the refugee, not the refugee organization, the international organizations they virtually didn't ever do screening. But it was done, but it's done with an appeals mechanism. And so many of the people, it is hard to get people, the individual stories told in full. To some degree, you can find them in the eligibility files. And they would say, I was in a German POW camp when the Americans came in. Then I was in American POW camp with the Germans. And then they screened me and they said that I'd volunteered and therefore wouldn't, therefore I had trouble. And they would say, I applied to UNRRA or IRO, and I got turned down in July 1947, and I applied again in 1948 and again in 1949, and then I got accepted. I mean, but this is a sort of outline story that you can see from their late applications to the Eligibility Bureau of IRO. I mean, there is no way of corroborating that story other than information that IRO may have, which occasionally it will say, he's not telling the truth about this. But mainly they just don't have information of that kind.
Okay, please.
Yeah, I wonder, first of all, thank you for presentation. I wonder how the Soviet side of the reception or the looking for Soviet citizens were working, because I particularly study political migration to the Soviet Union, and there's a collection of documents just been published by the Museum of Second World War in Gdansk about the Anders Army people who some of them willingly went to the Soviet Union, back to Soviet Union. Most of them were communists from Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, but how the Soviet Union was retroactively putting citizenship on them, because a bunch of those people petitioned that they weren't accepted into citizenship. They never went through passportization. They were, they thought that they're political migrants, but the Soviet Union said, no, you're a citizen, and henceforth you don't have any benefits. You only you belong to us and you need to come, you don't want to come. So-
Okay.
So-
Well, that is really and as I wish I had more of a handle on that. There are files of voluntarily repatriating Soviet citizens in Gulf, if a repatriation agency files, and they interviewed them. This is not filtration interviews, it's after filtration. They've got through filtration, all these people. And they interview them about themselves. And there are a few people that either look to be, and I think there's some that say they are, and some that the interviewer thinks they are. And the disposition of those people is unclear because it's not written in any of the files I saw to an MVD. In other words, they're not going through saying this is an arrestable person. Let's inform the appropriate authorities. Or if they are, it is not written on this file. But on the political migrants thing, just I'm sure you know much more about it than I do. But one odd sort of source of information I found. I looked at in an article published in Russian Review called "The Women's Side of the Story," and that was looking at the women DPs who are returning, and a big issue was those that had married a foreigner, and they want to bring the foreigner, and they can come, and the children can come, and they say to them, "Look, you come now, and we'll." He'll get a visa after a while, but, he has to wait. And in general, they never did get that visa. But among those, there are a group that say, well, I married this Italian, he's a communist, he wants to come to the Soviet Union. And they say, yeah, very nice, but you'll have to wait a little while. You come back now. So unfortunately, the files I see, they don't get to the ultimate disposition of those cases. But what they show is that what it looks like is that it doesn't matter if you're a communist. If you were the non-citizen person who married a Soviet citizen and want to return with them, doesn't matter. You're not being accepted, which is all the odder given their absolutely universal taking of all Soviet citizens. So you take a Kalmuk who fought against you and whose people have been deported, but you're not going to take an Italian communist who has married a Russian and desperately wants to live there.
Okay, first up, David Wolf, and then come to.
Thanks, Sheila. That's just great. I would say you know much more about this than me because you ran that big project for almost 10 years, and I had the honor of being a small piece of your project. So thank you very much. So I had a couple of questions. The book, of course, looks like a crucial reference book for anyone who's going to do this in the future. It sort of lays out, piece by piece, every future topic that anybody's going to want to dig into further. One of the things I wanted to ask about was to what extent UNRRA and IRO draw on the legacy of the League of Nations. There's been quite a bit written about the way in which the League of Nations falls apart before World War II, but many of the key personnel are brought to the US, hundreds of them, and they're kind of available for the tasks of the United Nations after the war, so that the technology of international organization is kept alive in the US during the war.
That is
right. So I'm wondering to what extent the spirit of the League of Nations is in any of these organizations. And again, it's an open question. And again, you'd have to look at individual lives, but you do that extremely well. So, you'd have to look at the background of the key administrators and see where they came from.
Yeah,
so that's
one
question.
okay.
Maybe I hit a ping. Maybe there's someone who you can think of. And I'm trying to think, what's the name of the guy from Columbia who wrote the demography book?
Oh, Matt Connolly?
Yeah, so Matt Connolly had a book on history of international government and the idea of world government.
Right.
And he has a whole chapter about that. But I don't remember exactly, you know, he does it kind of piece by piece, you know, international finance, you know, so maybe there's something in there. So that,
You know, I didn't feel the League as a presence, but I didn't do, in particular, I didn't do a study of UNRRA staffing. I tried to do a bit about the UNRRA to IRO, because, you know, the talk is we're getting rid of all these hopeless UNRRA people, but in fact, IRO is largely staffed by UNRRA people. And, you know, that I did, but I didn't look at the other one. And I was not what I was getting the New Deal, and I wasn't getting the League. Where the League is the most direct contract is with the what's it called, IGCR, Intergovernmental Committee on or Council on Refugees, which is a League creation which survives into UNRRA times, and it's an annoyance to UNRRA. A strong annoyance. UNRRA, I mean, it's considered to be a minor thing, but a big nuisance. They do resettlement when UNRRA doesn't want to do resettlement in their very small way. You know, we're talking a handful, half a dozen people, but still they are in the business of resettlement. And in a way, the way they talk about them, as I, without formulating the question properly, as you've done it, I sort of took it to be a repudiation of the whole League and Nansen, and sort of that whole stuff, that whole line ran aground. And no, I don't think any of the top people in UNRRA actually are League people, are they?
I don't have the answer to this. It was just.
I mean, it was news. I didn't realize that they'd been kept on ice in America.
They're at Princeton. They're sort of at Princeton.
Okay, well, maybe together we can produce some names and I can run them against my, yeah.
Had they handled refugee problems for the League? David,
Sorry?
had they handled refugee problems for the League of Nations, or were they working out of their capacity?
The individuals?
Yes.
So I don't remember which individuals, but several hundred people were brought over in the same, again, it's Rockefeller money, so the Rockefeller.
But the Nansen was really running his operation quite fairly separately, wasn't he, in the League? And I my sense, I haven't looked at this as carefully as I might, my sense was that he was, you know, he was guarding the sort of sovereignty of his, or not sovereignty, but in other words, I wouldn't have assumed that Nansen people were strong, owed an allegiance to the broader
Right.
League.
You certainly presented those organizations as an alternative, something different from the Nansen project earlier, but I wonder if there's continuities as well. But it's more a question than an answer.
Okay, go ahead, Dave.
Okay, so you all, you know, the need for labor, of course, is the driving force for people being willing to take refugees. And that's true, I guess, of all of the countries. Everyone needs labor after the war. Everyone has population losses.
But US much less, surely.
The US certainly.
You don't get any sense that it's a labor need that's driving the US.
Oh, that's certainly true, although the US takes more than any.
It does, yeah, but right.
Right. But you added additionally that the Soviet Union was interested in taking people back, not only for labor purposes, but they would take anyone. They would scour even for
Psychiatric
wards, et cetera. But even in the pre-war period, there's a big effort to passportizatia, the idea of trying to get former Soviet citizens to take up a Soviet passport, even if they're not going to come back to the Soviet Union, because there's because it gives them a certain control and a leverage over those people that keeps them from becoming dissidents beyond the borders. Is there any sense of that as well? I've seen this for Harbin,
Yeah, right, right. I mean, it's,
So at Harbin, they receive instruction that their number one task in dealing with the whites at Harbin is to try to make sure every single one of them gets a Soviet passport, whether or not they're going to come back to the Soviet Union.
right. And I mean, the two, yes, that's very much the Harbin story that I've come across too. With regard to Europe, they're active with the French, with the interwar, trying to get former French emigres to return. But whether they are, I'm not sure that they're following the same logic of urging passports on them, even if they want to return. I just don't have that sense. Then, of course, there's the question of the Armenians, which is a different one. But one of the reasons that the Soviet insistence on having everyone return struck me was that it was so different from after the First World War. When, I mean, this is okay, a very new government, but they by no means want everybody to return. They think a lot of these are class enemies. Why would we want these people back? And so they're very selective about who they take. It's an extremely different attitude after the Second World War than after the First.
Yeah, but Soviets lost 27 million. They needed each and everyone they could get. And they were sent to, Belarus was totally destroyed. Ukraine was totally destroyed. So there was bad necessity in the very simple physical labor. I think that's why they took, psychiatric hospitals as well. Because who cares, you can kill them if they do something wrong. So.
Well, of course, labor needs have got to be the major thing. I mean, that's the obvious and overwhelming reason why they would want the people back. But what I was struck in the rhetoric and also the Soviet repatriation, the agency's handling of this, by the sense that there's something else going on as well. I mean, I would put labor at the top, but this sense that is on the one hand covered by I tried to catch lost souls as a reference to serfdom and the ownership of people. One is we own these people, therefore it is a great outrage that our property is being taken by someone else. And then the repatriation agencies take on that. It's a different one. They basically operate on the frequently stated assumption, which they try to believe in, that the Soviets all want to come back. They want to come back. And here they frequently talk about the women. These women DPs. We've talked to them, and they long to come back, but they married somebody or other who isn't a Soviet citizen and can't come back or whatever. So there's this feeling of that they're on a noble mission. So that the repatriation agency's sort of internal propaganda, so to speak, focuses very much on children. We have saved so many children. We have searched out in Germany and found these Soviet children in German orphanages, and we rescued them and brought them.
Exactly what Putin is doing now with Ukrainian children. Exactly the same.
So,
And the same reason.
so on a point of information, isn't intermarriage illegal for Soviet citizens in this period?
Now, this is an interesting question. 1947, it is made illegal. Most of these marriages predate 47. But the other thing is, the literature, I looked at the literature on that, and it all, because that law affected some Western journalists and diplomats who were married to Soviets, and they were very upset about it. The assumption has always been that it was a sort of anti-elite. It was warning the elite not to be too Westernizing. But I mean, if you look at it in quantitative terms, the huge majority of Soviet citizens who had married foreigners were displaced persons who married them in Europe. And that's, therefore, I mean, since I could find nothing about Stalin's interest in this issue, anything here would be speculation. I don't know whether whoever formulated that law was thinking of DPs or was thinking of Bob Tucker. But yeah.
I'm going to take 3 questions now, and then as a group, and then come back to Sheila. So please, right here, and then Natasha, and then
Okay. One thing I want to mention, you were talking about Matthew Connolly at Columbia on the League of Nations. Susan Peterson has a very big book, The Guardians, about the League of Nations in the interwar period. And I think there are some things of relevance on refugee.
It contains a whole chapter.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so I just thought I'd throw that out. What I wanted to ask you is, your book gives a lot of presentation about the obstacles from anti-Semitism on these questions, on how countries were dealing with the DP and refugee question. And what I want to raise, I remember we had at Harvard for over 30 years teaching over at social studies, this seminar, Martin Peretz, commander-in-chief of the New Republic. And he used to always complain that the United States was too generous allowing Soviet Jews and others to come to the United States because he wanted them to go to Israel. And I wanted to know in the Zionist movement whether there was some objections to people welcoming Jewish DPs and refugees to countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, because this was a theme of Marty's sometimes. He thought we were too generous, and it's a little odd, somebody who was always seen as such a partisan of the Jewish community, but this was one of his ideological positions to strengthen Israel.
Well, it's really.
Okay, go ahead,
Oh,
Sheila. I
sorry.
was no, go ahead. Go ahead. Because I do want to mention, for example, the one East European country in which Jews were not annihilated during the war, which was Bulgaria. The large majority of them moved to Palestine shortly after the war. So the Bulgaria was left with relatively few Jews afterward, but it's because they did migrate to Palestine. In any case, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating question, and it's one that I can't answer in detail, but I note on the question of where the Jewish DPs ought to go, there are at every stage, there are dominant opinions, but there are opposing opinions. I mean, even in Palestine, some people said, terrific, here are these DPs, that's population, we need population. And other people said, no, they didn't want those people. So that was a minority view, but in places, yeah, it's the Australian case that I would know more, and it becomes an issue, but it's not the just in the wake of the war. It's all the focus is simply on getting them. Well, you see, the Australian Jewish community is not really able to help get DPs from Europe to Israel. It can only help them to get to Australia. In other words, so that to the extent that people want to help and want to solve a problem, the immediate solution they will see is get them to us. Then comes a certain, the Australian Jewish community goes very Zionist. But then, so that's a question. Should they be staying with us? Now we've got them out. Should they stay here or should they go to Israel? But I only know that impressionistically.
Natasha.
Thanks. Thank you so much. So two very specific questions. One, I'm very curious to hear, so you talked a little about the internal messaging in God, but then what was the Soviet messaging more broadly about DPs within the Soviet Union, the sort of public-facing propaganda? I'm very curious to hear how the return of the DPs was framed to the Soviet citizenry. And the second question is, you mentioned, I think, that the story about collaboration and the complexity of DPs who may have been collaborators with the Nazis lay dormant until the 80s or 90s, and I was very curious to hear why that was.
Right. Yes, the Soviet messaging on the return was, there wasn't much. In other words, this is not one of the topics that you want to talk about much. The image before the Soviet public was that there were Soviet children who had got stranded in Europe and in German orphanages and etc., who needed to be rescued. And that becomes there are newspaper stories about, somebody who thought his son was totally lost, but then he found it and was reunited. So those are the stories. And then there was, even in the 60s, there was a television program, I've forgotten its name, all about so the return of adults. But the great thing about children is they have no political ideas, they're not tired. But adults are a different matter. And so basically, I would say there's largely silence on that. And the collaborate, just tell me again,
Why did it lay dormant until?
Oh, right. Well, what happens is that the people who could be accused of collaboration from the DPs, plus the Jewish DPs, they go to the same countries, right? And in the United States, Australia, Canada, etc., within those communities, there is always a belief within the Jewish community that in the Latvian and Ukrainian and Belarusian, there are collaborators and indeed war criminals. And the governments don't want to hear about this. The Jews really don't bring it, they don't talk about it a lot. The Soviet government will every now and again send a list of war criminals saying, we want these people repatriated and extradited and prosecuted, and all the governments of the West will always refuse that. However, in the 1980s, partly because of a sort of much stronger sense about the Holocaust in the United States, it starts up that prosecutions of people, essentially collaborators from among the DPs, on the grounds that they had failed to reveal that they were collaborators and were therefore illegal immigrants. Those prosecutions. Those prosecutions are imitated in all the countries of the West, particularly Australia, and in the late 80s, there's a lot of ethnic tension within, because among the accusers will be Jewish migrants, and the ethnic communities of the people accused rally behind them and say that's all lies. And both of them bombard the committee, the investigating committee, with information. In the Australian case, they try to prosecute not for illegal immigration, but prosecute as for war crimes, essentially. And all the prosecutions fail because they depend on, the government has by now, and its investigating agency has accepted the validity of Soviet evidence provided by Soviet authorities, and they're working with them, as in the US. But the courts often don't want to accept it. And since these cases are almost invariably, the only evidence here is information from other DPs in the migrant population, and information that comes from the Soviet Union, or from the there are the Jewish investigating groups. So there's some.
Those cases could get very contentious, and sometimes even it wasn't clear, like the Ivan Demjanjuk, who was accused of being a Nazi camp guard. There was fairly convincing evidence presented about it, but almost all of it remains in doubt, even to this day, with the opening of archives and everything. So it often became very contentious.
And even where, there is a famous case, I can't remember his name, but a Latvian case who.
Aras case.
No, not him. No, this is the one who was, he was in, it starts with a K. He was in Australia.
Calais.
Yeah, that's right. And so they go after him in Australia, and then does he go to America? And then they go after him in America, comes back to Australia, they find him there. He then goes to Canada, if I'm not mistaken, and then to England, where he ends up in a Latvian old people's home, and he dies there. And of course, that's what happens in the late 80s and 90s. After a while, the people, guilty or not guilty, they die because they're old. And so.
Okay, we are running rapidly out of time, but one last question.
When you say collaborators, who do you have in mind?
Well, the term, I'm using the term that was used, but in my own understanding of it, it covers a very wide spectrum of from people who, for example, were, let's say, a teacher or an accountant or something in a Russian provincial town or a Ukrainian provincial town that's occupied by the Germans, and they stay on and work as teacher and perhaps as head teacher under the Germans. Now that formally speaking is collaboration, but it may have no ideological content and so on. On the other, at the other extreme are the people who not only served under German command, but committed atrocities under German command, shooting,
Like Vlasovцы.
well, not all Vlasovцы.
There were, as Sheila mentioned, some of the comic groups that there's a very, for anyone who is interested in reading Yoshi Kaczynski's novel, The Painted Bird, there is a memorable scene in there in which comics sweep through, I think it's a Polish town, and the sorts of, exactly as you mentioned, I mean, atrocities understates what they did. It's a novel, so but it is depicted in part on Kaczynski's own experience living through Poland during the war.
And of course, also, yes, so there are those people, and on that, going back to the side that you can use the term collaboration, but it may not really make political sense. Women who have an affair with, and perhaps a child by a German, I mean, that covers an awful lot of DP women. And those children have to be, as it were, rebranded as not of German, not with German fathers. But, this kind of collaboration, in quotes, presumably has no ideological whatever, content, whatever. So it's a very wide spectrum, and war crimes is only, anything that could be called a war crime is only at one end of it. But the IRO and UNRRA were not meant to take anybody that came under the heading of collaborator.
I see.
Okay, very good. So let me, first of all, thank Sheila very much. Thanks everyone for coming. And Sheila will be at the CEASE convention coming up, and will certainly be willing to discuss these questions further. So anyway, thank you, Sheila.